Sterling Voss didn't knock. He never knocked. He walked through the front door of the Blackstone ranch house like he already owned it, because in his mind, he already did. He dropped a leather folder on Gavin Mercer's kitchen table, flipped it open, and tapped the first page with 2 fingers. "Sign it tonight," he said. "I'm not making this offer again." Gavin stared at the number on the page. It wasn't a generous offer. It was an insult dressed up in clean ink. "My grandfather built this ranch," Gavin said. Voss smiled the way men smile when they've already decided how something ends. "And you can't afford to keep it. Sign the paper, Mercer, or I'll make sure you lose it for nothing." He walked out without waiting for an answer. He didn't need one. He'd already sent 3 men to cut the fence line along the eastern pasture. He'd already arranged for the water pump to fail by morning. Sterling Voss didn't negotiate. He dismantled. And Blackstone Ranch was next. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that a woman was coming. And she was going to take everything he'd planned apart, piece by piece, with her bare hands. If this story already has you gripping the edge of your seat, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Subscribe to this channel right now and follow Evelyn's story all the way to the end, because I promise you, what happens next will shock you. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it. What? The wagon that carried Evelyn Carter to Blackstone Ranch arrived on a Tuesday, which was the least remarkable thing about the entire morning. She sat in the back with her trunk wedged between her knees and a burlap bag holding 3 jars of preserved peaches balanced across her lap. Not because she'd packed sentimentally, she wasn't that kind of woman, but because the peaches had belonged to her mother and she hadn't been able to leave them behind. Everything else she owned fit in the trunk. That was the whole of Evelyn Carter at 29 years old. 1 trunk, 3 jars of peaches, and a reputation that had followed her like a shadow from the moment she turned 12 and grew wide where other girls grew narrow. The driver, a sun-leathered man named Poole, who'd been hired to bring her out from Abilene, hadn't spoken more than a dozen words the entire trip. He'd glanced at her once when she climbed in, let his eyes move over her in that particular way people had, the kind of look that measured and dismissed in the same second, and then turned forward and clicked the horses into motion. She didn't say anything about the look. She'd stopped saying anything about looks around the time she was 15. The ranch appeared around a bend in the road just after noon, the main house sitting low and serious against the flat Texas sky. A cluster of outbuildings spread out behind it like thoughts scattered after a hard conversation. Fencing ran in lines across the pasture. A windmill stood idle. 3 horses moved slow and deliberate near the far edge of the property, and somewhere behind the barn, someone was hammering something that didn't want to be hammered. It wasn't beautiful. It was functional, which Evelyn respected more. Poole pulled the wagon to a stop near the front gate, and before she'd even gotten herself to the edge of the wagon bed, she heard them. There were 4 ranch hands standing by the corral fence, and they weren't pretending not to notice her. One of them, a narrow-shouldered man with sun-damaged skin and a smirk built permanently into the left corner of his mouth, said something to the one beside him, quiet enough that she couldn't catch the words. But she caught the sound that followed, the kind of laugh that doesn't need a punchline, because the joke is the person. Evelyn climbed down from the wagon without help. She set the peach jars on top of her trunk, picked up the trunk by its leather handle, and carried it toward the gate herself. The narrow-shouldered man raised his voice. "Hey, Poole, you bring us a cook or a barn wall?" More laughter. 2 of the others looked away, which Evelyn noted was not the same as objecting. She set the trunk down just inside the gate and looked at the man who'd spoken. He was maybe 25, with the kind of confidence that came from never having been seriously wrong about anything that mattered. "What's your name?" she asked. He blinked. It wasn't the response he'd expected. "What?" "Your name. I like to know who I'm talking to." He looked at his companions, then back at her. "Hatch," he said. "Dale Hatch." "All right, Dale." She picked the trunk back up. "I expect we'll see a lot of each other." She walked past him toward the house, and she didn't look back because she'd learned a long time ago that looking back was exactly what people like Dale Hatch wanted. They wanted to watch you retreat. She wasn't retreating, she was arriving, The front door opened before she reached it. Gavin Mercer was not what she'd pictured from her uncle's descriptions, which had included the words solid and successful, and which Evelyn had understood to mean her uncle had never visited Blackstone Ranch and was relaying information secondhand. The man standing in the doorway was 36 or thereabouts, with the kind of face that had probably been pleasant once and was now just tired. He was tall, broad across the chest, and wearing a look that landed somewhere between duty and apology. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Mercer." He looked at her trunk. "I'd have had someone bring that in." "I managed." A beat passed between them. It was the kind of beat that was doing a lot of work, registering differences, measuring distances, calculating what the next several months were going to feel like. "Come in," he said, and stepped back. The inside of the house was clean in a utilitarian way, nothing decorative. A stone fireplace, a wooden table with 4 chairs, a shelf of ledgers along one wall, and a cast-iron stove that had clearly been worked hard. Evelyn walked in and set her trunk near the wall and stood in the center of the room and looked at it the way she looked at any new place. Carefully, the way you'd examine something before deciding whether it was sound. "I'll show you your room," Gavin said. "In a minute." She turned to face him. "I want to be direct with you, Mr. Mercer, because I think it saves time." He crossed his arms. Not defensively, more like he was bracing himself for something he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. "Go ahead." "I didn't choose this arrangement any more than you did. I'm not here because I wanted a husband, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. What I'm here for is whatever this place needs." She paused. "I'm good at seeing what things need. I'd rather be useful than comfortable." Gavin looked at her for a long moment. "You always this blunt?" "Generally." Something moved across his face that wasn't quite amusement but was adjacent to it. "My foreman's going to hate you," he said. "He can hate me and I can still work," Evelyn said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." He showed her the room. It was small and at the back of the house, with a window that looked out over the eastern pasture. She put her trunk at the foot of the bed and her peach jars on the windowsill where the morning light would hit them. Gavin appeared in the doorway behind her. "Supper's at 6. If you're hungry before that, there's cornbread on the counter." "Thank you." He started to leave and then stopped. "The men outside, Hatch, and the others." He didn't finish the sentence in the usual way. He didn't say they're decent enough once you know them or don't let them bother you. He just said, "I'll talk to them." "Don't bother on my account," Evelyn said. "I'll handle Hatch myself." Gavin looked at her like he wanted to say something else and thought better of it. He left. She stood at the window for a while, watching the eastern pasture. The horses were still out there, moving slow. The windmill was still idle. And there, at the far edge of the fence line, where the posts met the dry earth, she could see something she hadn't seen from the road. A gap. A wide gap, fresh broken, the post leaning at an angle that didn't come from weather or time. That came from being cut. She made a mental note and let the curtain fall. The barn fire started at 4 in the morning. Evelyn was already awake. She'd slept the first 2 hours and spent the next 4 lying with her eyes open, cataloging the sounds of the ranch the way she'd cataloged sounds in every unfamiliar place she'd ever slept. The creak of timber, the movement of wind through gaps in the exterior wall, the shift of horses in the pasture. She'd learned to read places through their sounds before she ever learned to read them through her eyes. The smell reached her first. Smoke, but not clean smoke. Not cooking smoke or fireplace smoke. This was the sharp, oily smell of something structural burning, and it hit her like a fist in the chest. She was out of bed and pulling on her boots before she'd fully processed the thought. She grabbed her coat off the hook, not because she needed warmth, but because she'd need her hands free, and a coat meant pockets. The barn was on the south end of the property, 60 yards from the house. By the time she came through the back door and across the yard, she could see the glow. Not flames yet from this angle, just glow, that particular orange that means something solid is eating itself alive. She ran. The hands were already gathering. She counted 5 of them, standing in a rough semicircle at a safe distance from the barn doors, and none of them were moving toward it. Hatch was in the middle, arms at his sides, face lit up orange by the glow, and wearing an expression that Evelyn read in less than a second. Not panic, not urgency, but something paralyzed and calculating, the expression of a man doing math about risk. She could hear the horses inside, not the casual sounds she'd tracked from her window. These were terror sounds, high, ragged, nothing like regular horses. The sound of animals that knew exactly what was happening and couldn't stop it. "The horses," she said as she reached the group. "How many inside?" Nobody answered immediately. She grabbed Hatch's arm. "How many?" "6," he said. "But the doors, the smoke. Where's a wet cloth? Anything wet?" "You can't go in." She was already moving. There was a water trough 8 feet from the barn's south wall. Not much, but enough. She plunged both arms in up to the elbows, soaked the front of her coat, pressed the wet sleeve over her nose and mouth. Someone behind her, not Hatch, one of the others, said, "She's going in." She hit the barn door with her shoulder, and it gave. The smoke rolled out at her like something alive, and she went in anyway. The inside of the barn was not yet fully engulfed. The east wall was burning from the bottom up, the old dry wood catching in moving sheets, but the center of the structure was still intact. She could see, barely, through the smoke, the stall gates, and she could hear where each horse was by the sound of their panic. The nearest stall was to her left. She got her hand on the latch, and it was hot, not burning, and she yanked it open. The horse came out fast, and she stepped hard to the side to avoid being trampled, and she kept moving to the next stall. 3 minutes inside a burning barn is a very long time. By the second stall, she was coughing hard, her eyes streaming, the smoke sitting in her lungs like gravel. She got that gate open, kept moving. Third stall, fourth. Her hands were working on training and instinct now because her brain was starting to lose the thread. The smoke was thickening and the heat from the east wall was pushing harder. She made it to the 5th horse and then her boot caught something on the ground. A fallen beam. She couldn't tell. She couldn't see. And she went down hard on one knee. The pain was white and immediate. She stayed down for what might have been 3 seconds, or might have been 30, hands braced on the dirt floor, and the sound around her was extraordinary in the worst possible way. Fire-consuming, horses screaming somewhere behind her toward the door, the structure of the barn doing the things structures do when they're about to give. She got up. She got the 5th stall open. She moved to the 6th. The 6th horse was backed all the way to the far corner of its stall, which was the closest to the burning wall, which made the air there nearly impossible. She couldn't see the animal properly. She operated by sound and feel. She got her hand on the latch, got it open, reached in the dark and smoked for the horse's halter, found it, pulled. The horse didn't want to move. Horses don't want to move toward fire, even if fire is behind them. This is a thing Evelyn knew from her father's farm, and she worked with it instead of against it, getting alongside the animal, blocking it from seeing what was behind, and giving it only one direction forward, and then she moved, and the horse moved with her. They came out of the barn together, the horse breaking free of her grip the moment open air hit it, and Evelyn took 3 steps and sat down in the dirt. She became aware of several things at once: the cold of the ground under her hands, the quality of the night sky above her, more stars than she usually let herself look at, the sound of the ranch hands, which was different now, different in its absence of mockery and its presence of something that hadn't been there before. Someone crouched in front of her. It wasn't Hatch. It was an older man, 60s or close to it, with a face like weathered oak and eyes that had seen a lot of things and weren't always kind about what they'd seen. 6 horses, he said. She nodded. Are they all out? All 6, he paused. I'm Rudd. I'm the foreman. I figured. She coughed. Her ribs hurt where the knee fall had transferred up through her spine. The east wall, she said, before you get the fire put out. Save some of the burned material. The base of the wall. Rudd looked at her steadily. Why? Because that fire started from the outside, she said, not from in. A silence. Behind her she heard Gavin Mercer's voice for the first time since supper, and it was not the tired, careful voice he'd used in the house. It was the voice of a man whose property was burning. He was asking Rudd something, and Rudd said low enough that Evelyn almost didn't catch it. She got all 6 out, sir. Went in alone. Another silence. This one had a different shape to it. Gavin came around to her side and crouched where Rudd had been. He looked at her coat, which was destroyed. He looked at her hands. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "My knee. Nothing broken." She looked at him directly. "The fire was set, Mr. Mercer." He held her gaze. "I know," he said, and his voice was level in the way voices get level when someone has been expecting bad news and has finally received it. "I know it was." Dawn was a thin line on the east horizon by then, gray and reluctant, and the barn was still smoking, and 6 horses stood alive and shaken in the yard, and Dale Hatch stood off to the side where he'd stood the whole time without moving, watching the woman he'd laughed at 8 hours ago brush soot off her coat and stand up straight. He didn't say anything. Neither did the man beside him. In the gathering light, Evelyn Carter looked at what remained of the barn wall, and what she saw there told her something she hadn't known that morning, that Blackstone Ranch was not just struggling. It was being hunted, and whoever was hunting it had started before she arrived, and would not stop simply because they hadn't expected her. She tucked that knowledge away next to the image of the cut fence post she'd seen from her window. Then she walked back toward the house to clean the soot off her hands and start thinking about what came next. The knee swelled by mid-morning. Evelyn didn't tell anyone. She wrapped it herself with a strip of cloth torn from an old shirt she found in the bottom of her trunk, pulled her boot back on over the wrapping, and walked with only a slight hitch in her step that she worked hard to minimize. Pain was information. It told you where your limits were. It didn't tell you to stop. She spent the first part of that morning at the burned barn wall, doing exactly what she'd told Rudd to preserve, examining the base of the east wall before anyone cleaned it up or hauled the debris away. She crouched in the soot and ran her fingers along the charred wood at ground level, and what she found there confirmed what she'd already suspected. The burn pattern started from outside, low and concentrated, the kind of spread that comes from something applied rather than something accidental. The interior of the barn would have produced a burn that moved upward from a lamp or a scattered coal. This had moved inward. She'd seen the same pattern once on her father's property, years ago, when a neighbor with a grudge and too much time had decided to make a point about a disputed water line. She stood up, brushed the soot off her palms, and stood, looking at the damage for a long minute before she walked back toward the main house. Rudd was waiting near the porch. Not pointedly. He was occupied with something, checking a length of rope for fraying, but she had the impression he'd positioned himself where he could see her coming. "You find what you were looking for?" he asked without looking up. "I found what I already knew was there," she said. He set the rope down. He was a careful man, she'd decided, the kind who didn't speak unless he had something to put behind the words. His face in the morning light was harder to read than it had been by firelight, but the eyes were the same, watching. "Mercer said you think it was deliberate," Rudd said. "It was deliberate. You been on this ranch one day." "I've been looking at burned wood for longer than that." She leaned against the porch post. "My father did land surveys for 20 years. I went with him from the time I was 8. You learn to read a lot of things when you spend that much time looking at what the land shows you." Rudd chewed on that for a moment. "There's been other things," he said slowly, like he was making a decision about how much to give. "The water pump on the north pasture went out 6 weeks ago. Thought it was age. Then the cattle near the creek started getting sick, and the vet couldn't give us a straight answer about why." Evelyn looked at him. "Didn't connect those things?" "We connected them to bad luck." He said it without defensiveness, just flatly, like a man acknowledging an error in arithmetic. "Ranch has had a rough year. It's easy to read rough luck as just rough luck. Until someone sets your barn on fire." "Until that," he agreed. She pushed off from the post. "I need to see the north pasture pump, and I want to know where exactly the cattle were grazing when they got sick." Rudd looked at her for a moment with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet. Not quite respect, not quite resistance, something sitting in between that hadn't resolved itself yet. "I'll have Connell ride out with you," he said. "I don't need a guide." "He knows the land," Rudd said. "You don't." It was reasonable. She nodded and let it stand. Connell turned out to be a young hand, maybe 22, with an honest face and the social awareness to not make any comments about her appearance or her presence on the ranch. He rode quiet, and pointed out the relevant landmarks when asked, and otherwise left her to her own thoughts, which she appreciated more than she would have said out loud. The North Pasture pump was a wreck. That was the only word for it. The housing had been damaged in a way that suggested impact, not the gradual deterioration of an aging mechanism, but the specific failure pattern of something struck hard from the outside. She got down off her horse and examined the pipe connection at the base, and there she found it, a hairline split in the coupling that had been packed with what looked like dry clay, the kind of patch that would hold long enough to look like the pump was failing on its own, then give out completely when the pressure built. Someone had disabled this pump and made it look like wear. She sat back on her heels and looked out across the North Pasture at the dry ground where the grass had gone thin and yellow. Without consistent water from this pump, the cattle that grazed here would have been pushed down to the creek for water, the creek where they'd gotten sick. "Connell," she said. "Ma'am." "The cattle that got sick, were they the ones that grazed out here?" He thought about it. "Most of them, yeah. Rudd moved them down toward the creek when the pump gave out, because the creek was the next closest source. And the vet? What did he say exactly? What were the symptoms?" Connell shifted in his saddle. "Sluggish. Losing weight even though they were eating. A couple had trouble walking. Doc Henner thought it might be some kind of grass problem, bad forage, but he couldn't pin it down." That sounded like poisoning. Not dramatic, not fast, the slow kind, the kind you introduce into a water source and let do its work over weeks. She'd read about it in one of her father's reference manuals, the section on land disputes, and the illegal methods some operators use to devalue a competitor's property. At the time, she'd read it as historical information, something people used to do. "I need to get to the creek," she said. The creek was 3/4 of a mile south. She took a water sample from the main cattle drinking spot using an empty tin she'd thought to bring, and she took a second sample 20 yards upstream, and then she stood at the edge of the water and looked at the bank and found, after 10 minutes of working slowly along the bank, a spot where the earth had been disturbed recently, not by cattle hooves, but by something more deliberate, a shallow trench dug and then poorly filled back in, 30 feet upstream from where the cattle drank. She dug with her hands. 6 inches down, she found a cloth sack, wet and deteriorating, and inside it a residue she didn't touch directly, but that gave off a faint chemical smell that cut right through the smell of creek mud. She covered it back up carefully, left it exactly where it was. On the ride back, Connell glanced at her twice, and both times she was looking out at the land with the particular expression people get when they're running calculations in their heads. He didn't interrupt. Rudd and Gavin were both at the house when she got back, standing on the porch, in a conversation that had the tight, low quality of an argument being kept controlled. They stopped when she rode in. She dismounted without ceremony, tied her horse, and walked directly to them. "There's something buried in the creek bed upstream from the main cattle drinking spot," she said. "I don't know what it is exactly. I didn't disturb it more than I had to, but it smells like it belongs in a chemistry set, not a waterway. The cattle got sick because they were drinking poisoned water, and the water was poisoned deliberately after someone disabled your north pump to make sure the cattle would have to use the creek." Gavin stared at her. Rudd said, "You're certain?" "I'm certain about what I found. I can't be certain about who put it there. Those are two different questions." Gavin came down off the porch. There was a quality to his movement that she hadn't seen the previous night. Something had shifted. The tired, careful man who'd opened the front door for her was still in there, but something underneath it had woken up and wasn't careful at all. He walked past her to look out at the southern property line, as if he could see the creek from here. "Voss?" he said. The name came out like something he'd been holding between his teeth. "Who is that?" Evelyn asked. "Sterling Voss." Rudd said it like a man reading from a list of things he was tired of. "Land developer. Operates out of Lubbock, but he's got interests all over the western counties. He's been after this property for 2 years. He came here a week ago," Gavin said, still looking south. "Made me an offer. Not a fair one." "He made an offer to the Alderson family over in Crockett County," Rudd said to Evelyn, with the tone of someone providing necessary context. 2 years ago. They turned him down. 6 months later, their well dried up, their barn burned, and half their cattle were dead. They sold to him for 1/3 of the property's value. Evelyn absorbed this. "He's done this before." More than once, Rudd said, but nobody's ever proven it. The Aldersons couldn't prove anything. Neither could the Kelsey operation up north. What happened to the Kelseys? Rudd's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it settled colder. They didn't sell, lost everything, and walked away with nothing. The silence that followed was the kind that comes after information has landed fully. Evelyn pulled the 2 tin samples from her coat pocket and held them out. I need to know what's in the creek water, she said. Is there someone in town who can test this? A chemist, a pharmacist, someone who knows compounds. Gavin turned back from looking at the south line. He looked at the tins in her hand, then at her face. There's a man in Harlow who does assay work. Mines, mostly. But he'd know. How far is Harlow? 18 miles. I'll go tomorrow morning, she said. Gavin opened his mouth and she could see him forming the words, I'll send one of the men, and she held his gaze steadily enough that he reconsidered. All right, he said. She went inside. She needed to write down everything she'd observed. The burn pattern at the barn, the condition of the north pump, the location and depth of what she'd found at the creek, the approximate timing she could extrapolate from the condition of the sack. She was building something, not a story, evidence. She sat at the small table in her room and wrote for an hour, and the room got dark around her, and she lit a lamp and kept writing. Gavin knocked at 7. There's food. I'll be out in a minute. She finished the page she was on and capped the pen and came out to the kitchen where supper was on the table, beans and cornbread, and a piece of salt pork that had been warmed more than cooked. It wasn't a complaint. She'd eaten worse. They sat across from each other and ate in silence for a while. Not uncomfortable silence. Working silence, the kind that's occupied. The men, Gavin said finally. What Hatch said yesterday, when you arrived. I told you not to worry about it. I'm not worried about it, he said. I'm apologizing for it. There's a difference. She looked up from her plate. He was looking at her directly, not in the assessing way that people usually looked at her, not that inventory-taking look, but straight, the way you look at someone you're choosing to acknowledge as a person. Apology received, she said. Move on. He almost smiled. It was a near thing. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? He thought about it with more honesty than she'd anticipated. Someone who needed managing, he said. My cousin arranged this. He said you were quiet and agreeable and wouldn't cause trouble. Your cousin doesn't know me very well. No, Gavin said. He doesn't. He pushed the salt pork around his plate. I should tell you that when he proposed this arrangement, it wasn't something I wanted. Any of it. I want to be straight with you about that. I know, she said. I told you last night I didn't choose it either. That doesn't have to be an insult to either of us. It's just the truth. Right. He looked at the table. I just didn't want you to think I was indifferent to the rudeness. From the men. From me, at first. Were you rude to me? I was cold. You were cautious, she said. That's different. Cold means you don't care. Cautious means you're paying attention. She drank her coffee. I'd rather someone be cautious than pretend to welcome me and mean something else entirely. He looked at her again in that direct, considered way. Where did you learn that distinction? From a lifetime of people pretending, she said simply, and she wasn't bitter saying it, just matter of fact, and she watched him receive it and sit with it instead of brushing past it the way people sometimes did when they didn't want to acknowledge what they were hearing. After supper, she went back to her room and picked up the notes she'd made and read through them twice, and then sat at the window for a while, not looking at anything particular, just letting the threads run through her head in the way she always did when she was working out a problem. Her father had called it her quiet spinning. He'd been the first person in her life who'd treated that quality, the stillness, the observation, the inability to stop noticing things, as an asset rather than an oddity. She missed him in the particular way you miss someone who understood you without trying. Outside, the ranch had gone quiet. The hands were in the bunkhouse. The horses were still. The windmill that had been idle yesterday was turning now in a slight night wind, and the sound of it, that slow metal-on-metal rotation, was the loneliest sound she'd heard in a long time, but not in a bad way. In the way that loneliness is sometimes just honesty about how things are. She pulled the curtain to and went to bed. She didn't sleep well. Her knee ached through the wrapping. Her mind kept circling back to the creek, to the sack buried in the bank, to the specific effort it represented. Not just malice, but planning, patience, the kind of methodical damage that someone does when they're very confident they won't be caught. Sterling Voss had done this before. He'd done it to the Aldersons. He'd done it to the Kelseys. And both those times he'd succeeded because the people on the other end of it had been trying to survive what was happening to them instead of documenting it. That was the difference, she decided. Surviving and documenting were not the same work. Surviving was reactive. Documenting was something else. It was building a record, constructing a case, making something that would still exist and still matter after the immediate crisis had passed. She was going to document everything. She was going to be so thorough about it that when the time came, there wouldn't be a question. There wouldn't be ambiguity. There would only be a body of evidence so complete that not even a man with Sterling Voss's resources and connections could argue his way around it. She lay in the dark and thought about the fence line, the pump, the creek, the barn. 4 separate incidents. What looked like random bad luck when you took each one alone became something unmistakably deliberate when you laid them side by side. That was how this kind of scheme survived. By spacing out the damage, by keeping each piece small enough to explain away on its own. You had to see the pattern. You had to write it down. In the morning, she would ride to Harlow and get the water samples tested. She would ask the assay man to give her a written report, and she would pay for it from the small reserve she'd brought with her, because she didn't want to put the cost on Gavin's account and have any question later about who had commissioned it. She would keep everything she gathered separate from the ranch's records, in her own notes, in her own hand. And she would start paying very close attention to who on this ranch knew what and when, because the barn fire hadn't started itself, and whoever had set it hadn't done it from 18 miles away in Lubbock. Someone had walked up to the east wall of Blackstone Ranch's barn in the dark and applied something flammable to its base, and that someone had needed to know the layout of the property well enough to do it quietly. She didn't know yet what that meant, but she was going to find out. The windmill turned in the dark outside her window, and Evelyn Carter lay in a strange bed in a ranch that wasn't yet hers and thought about a man she hadn't met yet with the particular focused attention of someone who has just understood, clearly and without drama, exactly what kind of fight she's in. The ride to Harlow took 3 hours, and Evelyn spent most of it going over what she knew against what she could prove, which were 2 very different columns with a significant gap between them. She knew the barn fire was set from outside. She knew the north pump had been deliberately disabled. She knew something had been buried in the creek bank upstream from where the cattle drank. She knew all of this connected to a pattern. The Aldersons, the Kelseys, the same method applied to different properties until the owners broke. What she could prove right now, with what she had in her coat pocket, was considerably less. That was what the ride to Harlow was for. The assay man was named Pryor, and he operated out of a low building on the north end of town that smelled like sulfur and old paper. He was in his 50s, heavy-set, with the permanently stained fingers of a man who worked with chemicals for a living and had long since stopped worrying about it. When Evelyn walked in and set the 2 tins on his counter and explained what she needed, he looked at her over the top of his glasses with the particular expression men in professional settings often gave her, the brief recalibration, the deciding whether she was serious. She held his gaze and waited. He picked up the first tin. "Creek water," she said. "Upstream sample and downstream. I need to know if there's anything in the downstream sample that isn't in the upstream. And if there is, I need to know what it is, and I need it in writing." "That takes time," he said. "How much time?" 2 days, maybe 3. Depends on what I'm looking for." "Look for everything," she said. "I'll pay for a full analysis." She slid the money across the counter, more than she'd intended to spend, less than she could afford to lose. "I need a written report with your name on it, formal, the kind that would hold up if someone needed to read it in an official context." Pryor looked at the money. He looked at the tins. He looked at her. "You from around here?" he asked. Blackstone Ranch, she said. I'm Evelyn Mercer. It was the first time she'd said it that way, and it sat oddly in her mouth, not badly, just unfamiliar, the way new tools feel before your hand has worn the grip down to fit. Pryor wrote something in a ledger. 3 days, he said. I'll have it ready. She thanked him and went back out to her horse and stood for a moment in the street and made a list in her head of the other things she needed to do while she was in town. She needed paper, more than she'd brought. She needed a second pen and an extra inkwell. And she needed, if she could find it, any public record related to Sterling Voss's land holdings in the western counties. The county clerk's office was 4 buildings down, a narrow room behind a door that stuck in its frame. The woman behind the desk was young, competent, and initially skeptical about the nature of Evelyn's inquiry, but Evelyn asked plainly and specifically. She was looking at land transactions in the western counties over the past 5 years, specifically properties that had changed hands at below market value. And after a short negotiation and the presentation of her identity as Gavin Mercer's wife, the clerk brought out the relevant volumes. She spent 2 hours at a side table with those volumes and her notebook, and what she found made her very still in the way she got still when something important was arranging itself into shape. Sterling Voss, through 3 separate holding companies with 3 separate names, had acquired 11 properties in the western counties over the past 6 years. Of those 11, 7 had sold at prices the surrounding land values made obviously wrong. Too low, substantially too low, the kind of prices you get when a seller is desperate and out of options. She cross-referenced the dates against everything she could find in the adjacent records, and in 4 of those cases she found prior filings, complaints about water disputes, notes about livestock illness, 1 partial record of a fire. She wrote down all of it, including the company names, the transaction dates, the prices paid, and the names of the sellers. The Aldersons were in there. The Kelseys were in there. So were 9 other families she'd never heard of. She rode back to Blackstone Ranch in the long afternoon light with her notebook full and her mind working, and when she arrived and found Gavin at the corral watching 2 of the hands repair the fence sections that had been replaced since the cut post she'd spotted on her first day, she dismounted and went straight to him. He has a pattern, she said. Voss, I found the records. Gavin turned from the fence. His face did something complicated. Relief and dread arriving at the same moment, fighting for position. Come inside, he said. She spread her notes on the kitchen table and walked him through it methodically, the way her father had taught her to present a survey. Start with what you can see, move to what you can measure, end with what the measurements tell you. Gavin stood across the table from her and listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. He wasn't the kind of man who interrupted just to make noise. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. 11 properties, he said. That I could find in 2 hours of records, she said. There may be more I didn't reach. And he uses different company names each time. 3 that I found. Possibly more. It makes the pattern harder to see if you're only looking at one county or one transaction. You have to look across all of them at once. Gavin sat down. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at her notes. Evelyn. He used her name like he'd just remembered he was allowed to. If you take this to the county sheriff isn't the right move yet, she said. He looked up. Voss has resources, she said. He's been doing this for 6 years without anyone stopping him. That means he has relationships, probably including relationships with people in official positions. If I walk into the sheriff's office with my notebook and a theory, I need the theory to be airtight before I do it, or the whole thing gets buried and Voss knows we're building a case against him. She sat down across from him. I need the water analysis from Pryor. I need to document the pump damage formally, with measurements. I need photographs of the barn wall if there's anyone in Harlow with a camera and the ability to develop plates. And I need to keep a daily log from here on of every single incident on this property. Time, location, what happened, who witnessed it. Gavin watched her. You've done this before. No, she said. But my father documented 3 land disputes over 20 years of survey work. I watched him do it. The disputes he won weren't the ones where he was right. They were the ones where he had paper. Something moved through Gavin's expression. It was the look of a man revising something. Not about her, she thought, but about the situation. like he'd been braced for a particular kind of fight and had just realized the fight required something entirely different. "All right," he said. "What do you need from me?" "Tell me everything that's happened on this property in the last 6 months. Every incident, in order, with as much specificity as you remember. And then I need you to tell Rudd and the hands, at least the ones you trust, to come to me if anything happens, anything at all. Not tomorrow, not when it's convenient. Immediately." "Rudd you've already got," Gavin said. "He came to me this morning and told me directly that you saw things at the creek he wouldn't have known to look for." That's something. Hatch is another story. Hatch is manageable, she said, with the flat certainty of someone who had already filed Dale Hatch under known quantities. "What I need more urgently is to understand the property itself, the full layout, the water systems, all of them, not just the north pump. If Voss's method is to cut off resources systematically, I want to know every resource on this land before he gets to the next one." Gavin spent the next hour walking her through the ranch in a way he clearly hadn't been asked to do in a long time, talking about the infrastructure of the place, the second pump on the west side, the cistern behind the main house that drew from an underground source, the state of the fence lines across the full perimeter. He knew his property the way people know things they've lived with their whole lives, thoroughly but imprecisely, the details blurring in places where habit had replaced observation. Evelyn took notes on all of it. By the time they finished, the light was going orange, and Rudd had appeared at the kitchen door to say there was a problem at the west pasture. It wasn't a dramatic problem. One of the cattle had gotten into a section of fence and torn it up trying to get back to the herd, and 2 posts needed resetting before dark. But Evelyn walked out with Gavin and Rudd to see it, because she'd decided she was going to see everything on this property now, large or small, and she stood at the fence line watching Connell and another hand work the posts back into the ground. That was when she noticed the wire. It was on the section of fence to the left of the damaged area. Not the section the cow had broken, but the one adjoining it. She crouched and looked at it without touching it. The wire had been cut and then twisted back together, not repaired properly. Twisted, the way you do it if you needed the fence to appear intact until the right moment, and then fail under pressure. "Rudd," she said quietly. He came over and crouched beside her. "How many other sections of this fence line have you physically checked by hand this week?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. "I need someone to walk the full perimeter tomorrow," she said. "Every foot of it. Check every section by hand." Rudd stood up and looked at Gavin. Gavin nodded. She straightened up and looked out at the west pasture where the cattle were moving in their slow, unconcerned way, and she felt the particular quality of anger that doesn't make noise, the kind that goes inward and becomes something useful rather than something loud. Someone had been walking the boundaries of this property and doing damage so carefully calibrated that it read as ordinary misfortune. The cut wire that looked like it failed on its own, the pump that looked like it wore out, the barn fire that could have been an accident, the creek that could have been bad forage, patient work, deliberate, patient, expensive work. She thought about what Rudd had said, that nobody had ever proven anything against Voss. She understood now exactly why. He didn't do things that left obvious marks. He did things that required someone to already be suspicious in order to recognize them for what they were. And by the time most people got suspicious enough to look, the evidence was either gone or buried under enough alternative explanations that it couldn't stand alone. But she was looking. She was looking at everything, and she was writing it down, and she had started 3 days in. That was 3 days before he expected anyone to be looking. The fence perimeter walk the following morning turned up 4 more sections of wire that had been compromised in the same way, cut and twisted, not broken. She photographed the locations in her notebook with detailed sketches since she hadn't yet arranged for a camera, and she measured the distance between the compromised sections and noted that they were spaced in a way that would create, under the right circumstances, a complete gap in the west pasture line. The cattle could drift out through water tableland that bordered a creek running along the western property edge. She already knew what was in that creek. She sent Connell to Harlow with a note for Pryor asking whether the analysis could be expedited and offering additional payment if he could turn it around in 2 days rather than 3. Connell came back the following afternoon with a note from Pryor saying he could have preliminary findings in 2 days, full written report in 3. She was sitting on the porch going through her notes when Gavin came out and leaned against the post. "Hatch asked about you today," he said. She looked up. What did he want to know? What you were doing, all the writing around, the notes. He paused. I didn't give him specifics. Good. He sat down on the step. It was the first time she'd seen him sit without something to occupy his hands. No tool, no ledger, no task to organize himself around. He looked out at the yard. He's not a bad hand, Gavin said, in the tone of someone being fair about something they'd rather not be fair about. Hatch. He's been here 4 years, works hard, he talks, Evelyn said. And he talks loudly where other people can hear him. Yeah. That's the problem with people like that, she said. They're not necessarily working against you, but they create noise. And noise is useful to someone who needs to know how things are going on this property without coming here himself. Gavin turned to look at her. I'm not saying Hatch is working for Voss, she said carefully. I'm saying that a man who comments loudly on everything unusual that happens here is a source of information for anyone listening in town. Harlow, Gavin said slowly, the feed store. Hatch goes in every 2 weeks. Does he talk there? Gavin said nothing for a moment. He talks everywhere. Then until this is finished, I'd ask you to be careful about what Hatch knows, she said. Not because I think he's crooked, because I think he's the kind of man who tells things without understanding. He's telling them. Gavin rubbed the back of his neck. It was a gesture she'd noticed he made when he was processing something he didn't like but couldn't argue with. All right, he said. I'll figure out how to handle it without making him suspicious. She went back to her notes. The evening was cooling fast, the way Texas evenings did in that season, dropping 20 degrees in an hour as the sun pulled away from the land. She'd grown up with plains weather, and it still surprised her sometimes, the speed of it. Evelyn? She looked up. Gavin was watching the road. A rider was coming in from the south, moving fast. Not panicking, but purposefully, the kind of speed that had intent behind it. He pulled up at the gate, and Evelyn recognized him as one of the younger hands who'd been sent to check the south fence line. Mr. Mercer. He was out of breath. There's a man. Down by the south marker. He's not on our land. He's just outside the line. But he's been there for an hour, and he's not moving. Gavin was already off the step. What's he doing? Just watching, the hand said. He's got a horse, and he's just sitting there, watching the property. The three of them looked at each other. And Evelyn, who had spent 6 days building a careful, methodical, documented case, felt the particular chill of understanding that the person on the other side of this wasn't waiting anymore. He was checking on his work. Don't approach him, she said before Gavin could say anything. Don't let him know we've seen him. Get that hand back to his position and have him look occupied. Gavin looked at her. If we approach him, he knows we're watching, she said. Right now, the only advantage we have is that he doesn't know how much we've found. Let him think the ranch is still just struggling. She held Gavin's gaze. Let him think it's working. Gavin stood very still for a moment. Then he turned to the rider. Go back. Don't look at him. Go back to the fence work and stay there. The rider nodded and turned his horse. Evelyn sat back in her chair and looked down at her notes and wrote one more line at the bottom of the page. Subject conducting surveillance from south boundary. Did not approach. Let him watch. She underlined the last sentence. Let him watch. Let him believe what he'd built was dismantling itself on schedule. Let him ride back to wherever Sterling Voss received his reports and tell him that Blackstone Ranch was quiet and troubled and had no idea what was coming. Because what was coming wasn't panic, and it wasn't revenge, and it wasn't some desperate act that a good lawyer could pick apart in an afternoon. What was coming was a document, a complete, signed, witnessed, chemically verified, legally legible document that accounted for every act of sabotage, every compromised fence line, every poisoned water source, every carefully arranged misfortune, traced back to its origin. And the woman building that document was sitting on the porch of the ranch he was trying to steal, in the cooling evening air, writing in a notebook with a steady hand and a very clear idea of what she intended to do with it. Pryor's report arrived on a Thursday, and it was worse than Evelyn had expected, which meant it was better than she'd hoped. Worse, because what he'd found in the downstream water sample was a compound used in industrial mining operations to leach metals from ore, a substance with no legitimate reason to be in a cattle ranch's creek water, toxic to livestock at sustained exposure, and slow-acting enough that a vet examining sick cattle would likely reach for half a dozen other explanations before landing on chemical contamination. Pryor had written it up in clean technical language, signed his name at the bottom, and noted the specific concentration levels in both samples, the upstream absence and downstream presence of the compound, and his professional conclusion that the contamination was not naturally occurring. Better, because every word of that report was exactly what she needed. She read it twice at the kitchen table while Gavin stood across from her and watched her face. "It's good," she said. "It's very good. He's thorough." "What does it say in plain language?" She looked up. "It says someone put industrial poison in your creek water, deliberately upstream, in concentrations that would make cattle sick over weeks without killing them fast enough to make the source obvious." She set the report down. "And it says it in language that any federal investigator would understand." Gavin put both hands on the table and leaned on them. "Federal," he said. "This isn't a county matter anymore," she said. "It may never have been. What Voss has done crosses property lines, crosses county lines, involves chemical contamination of water sources. That's not a local sheriff conversation. That's a conversation for the Federal Land Office." "The Federal Land Office," Gavin said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not doubt exactly, but the particular resistance of a man who'd been handling his own problems his entire life and was being asked to invite strangers into them. "That's not a fast process." "No," she agreed. "It's not, but it's the right one." She picked up her notebook and opened it to the section she'd organized the night before. The full timeline, everything she'd documented since arriving at Blackstone Ranch, cross-referenced with the public records she'd found at the Harlow clerk's office. "I've been building a file, Gavin, not just notes, a proper file, organized and sourced. Pryor's report goes in it. The clerk's records of Voss's transactions go in it. The sketches of the compromised fence sections, with measurements and dates. The description of the barn fire and the burn pattern witnessed by Rudd." She paused. "What I need now is the names of the families Voss took property from, the ones who are still alive and still around. The Aldersons, the Kelseys. If I can get their accounts, even informal ones, even just letters, it builds the pattern into something that can't be explained away." Gavin straightened up. "The Aldersons moved to New Mexico after they lost the property. I don't know where. The Kelseys. Tom Kelsey's brother still lives over near Crockett County. Earl Kelsey. He runs a small outfit there." "Can you get me to Earl Kelsey?" "It's a day's ride." "Can you get me there?" He looked at her for a moment. That look he'd developed over the past several days, the one that kept updating itself, like a ledger being corrected. "Yeah," he said. "I can get you there." They left early the following morning, before the hands were fully up, which Evelyn had suggested and Gavin hadn't argued with. She wanted the trip kept quiet. Rudd knew where they were going. No one else needed to. The ride to Crockett County was long and mostly silent, the comfortable kind that had developed between them gradually. Not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people who had learned that talking wasn't the only way to be present. The land opened up wide and flat in sections, and then folded into shallow draws and dry creek beds, and Evelyn watched it go past and thought about water, which she'd been thinking about obsessively for days. Where it ran, where it was blocked, where it could be poisoned, and where it couldn't. Water was the central fact of this land. Whoever controlled water controlled everything around it. Earl Kelsey was a short, sunburned man in his 60s who met them in his yard with the cautious expression of someone who'd learned the hard way to be suspicious of visitors. He relaxed when he saw Gavin. They knew each other, not well but enough. And he brought them inside and put coffee on and sat at his table with the careful, deliberate posture of a man carrying something heavy that he'd been carrying long enough to get used to the weight. Evelyn explained what she was building. She didn't soften it or dress it up. She told him about the barn fire and the creek and the fence wire in Pryor's report, And she told him she was trying to build a case that was complete enough to take to federal investigators, and that she needed accounts from the families Voss had already done this to. Earl Kelsey listened to all of it with his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Tom never talked about it much, he said finally. My brother. He was a proud man. Losing that property, it wasn't just the land. It was what it meant to him to lose it the way he did. Like something had been done to him that he couldn't name and couldn't prove and couldn't fight. He looked at his coffee. He died 2 years after they left. Not from anything specific, he just wore out. Nobody said anything for a moment. I'll write down what I know, Earl said. What Tom told me while it was happening. I don't have documents, but I have what he said. That's enough, Evelyn said. Write it in your own words, sign your name to it, and note the dates as best you remember them. That's all I need. He wrote for 40 minutes while they sat at his table. His handwriting was slow and careful, the handwriting of a man who hadn't written anything formal in a long time and was taking it seriously. When he handed the pages to Evelyn, she read through them at the table and found in them 3 specific incidents that mirrored what had happened at Blackstone Ranch. A water source that failed, fencing that came apart in a way that couldn't be explained by weather, livestock that sickened and recovered partially and then sickened again. The same method, the same patience, the same deliberate erosion of a working ranch until the people running it couldn't hold on anymore. She folded the pages carefully and put them in the document case she'd brought. Thank you, she said, and she meant it without decoration. Earl Kelsey walked them to the horses. At the gate, he stopped and looked at Evelyn with the direct, evaluating look of a man who didn't give his trust easily and was deciding whether to give it now. You think you can actually stop him? He asked. Voss? I think I can build something that stops him, she said. Whether it sticks depends on people who aren't me. But the building part? Yes, I can do that. He nodded once, the slow kind that means I believe you more than I expected to. Then do it, he said. Do it for Tom. She rode most of the way home without speaking. Gavin let her be. The sun crossed to the west and the light went long and gold across the flat land, and sometime in the middle of the 3rd hour, Gavin said, without preamble, My father would have liked you. She glanced at him. He wasn't a man who respected people easily, Gavin said. He had a specific idea about what made someone worth respecting. It wasn't how much land they had or how much money. It was whether they did what needed doing when it was hard to do it. He paused. He would have respected you. Evelyn didn't know what to do with that entirely, because no one had ever framed it quite that way. Not as tolerance, not as accommodation, but as the specific kind of respect given to people who function well under pressure. She sat with it for a moment. Your father built a good ranch, she said finally. He did, Gavin said. I've been trying not to lose it. You're not going to lose it. He looked at her and she looked back, and she meant it the way she meant most things, plainly, without embellishment, because she'd measured what she had, and she believed it was enough. They got back to Blackstone Ranch after dark to find Rudd waiting on the porch with an expression that meant something had happened. What? Gavin said before he'd even dismounted. Livestock pen on the east side, Rudd said. 3 calves. Found them about 2 hours ago. Same symptoms as the creek cattle. Sluggish, won't eat. Evelyn was off her horse. Where did they water today? That's what I need to show you. Rudd led them to the east pen with a lantern, and in its light Evelyn saw immediately what he'd brought them to see. The water trough in the east pen had a residue around the interior rim that didn't belong there. A faint discoloration, pale and faintly iridescent, the kind of thing you'd miss in daylight if you weren't looking for it. She didn't touch it. She got close and looked at it, and then stood up and looked at the trough's connection to the water line. The line ran from the main cistern, the underground source behind the main house that Gavin had pointed out as the most reliable water supply on the property. She walked the line with the lantern, crouching at each connection point, and at the 3rd joint from the trough, she found it. A small glass vial, still partially intact, wedged into the gap where the line's coupling connected to a secondary pipe. The vial had cracked, and the contents had been introduced into the water line, which fed the trough. She stood up and looked at Rudd. He's moved from the creek, she said. He's hitting the internal water supply now. Rudd's face in the lantern light was stone. The cistern itself, show me. The cistern was behind the house, covered by a wooden cap that was heavy enough to require two people to lift. Gavin and Rudd lifted it together, and Evelyn held the lantern over the opening and looked down at the water inside. And at the surface she found what she'd half expected and fully dreaded. A visible film, thin but there, the same iridescent quality as the trough residue, catching the lantern light in a way that clean water didn't. Someone had accessed the cistern. "How long has it been since anyone opened this?" she asked. Rudd and Gavin looked at each other. "Last check was 10 days ago," Rudd said. "It was fine then." "So in the last 10 days," she said, and she was very controlled saying it because this was not the moment to be anything else. "Someone came onto this property, accessed the cistern, introduced a contaminant, and ran a secondary delivery to the east trough through the water line." The silence that followed had a particular quality, the quality of people understanding something in its full dimension for the first time. Not just that they were being targeted, but how close the target had gotten. "My wife," Gavin said suddenly. He turned to look at the main house. "The kitchen water comes from the cistern?" she asked. "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "Have either of us been sick?" A beat. He thought about it, running it back. "No." "Then it was introduced recently," she said. "Probably in the last 48 hours, before tonight, before we got home. Someone knew we were gone today." She let that settle. Someone knew we were gone. Rudd set the lantern down on the cistern cap and ran his hand over his jaw. "Hatch," Gavin said quietly. Not an accusation, a realization arriving slowly. "I don't know that," Evelyn said. "But when we left this morning, who knew?" "Rudd. And Hatch saw us ride out. He asked Rudd where we were going." "What did Rudd tell him?" Rudd looked up from the lantern. "I said you had business in the South County. I didn't say where or who." "But he knew we'd be gone for the day." Another silence. Evelyn made a decision. Not an emotional one, a calculated one, the kind her father made in the middle of a difficult survey, when the data pointed toward a conclusion he didn't want to reach but couldn't logically avoid. "Get everyone in," she said. "All the hands, tonight. I want to talk to them." Gavin looked at her. "All of them. All of them. I'm not going to accuse anyone, but I'm going to tell them what's been happening on this property, and I'm going to tell them clearly, and I'm going to watch their faces when I do it." He held her gaze for a moment. Then, "Rudd, get everyone in." They gathered in the main room, 7 hands including Hatch, who sat in the back with his arms crossed and his face doing its careful, neutral arrangement. Evelyn stood at the front and she didn't perform calm. She just was calm, the way she'd been calm going into the burning barn, which was not the absence of urgency, but the presence of focus. She told them exactly what had been done to the ranch. The barn fire, the pump, the creek, the fence wire, the cistern tonight. She laid it out plainly, in order, the way you build an argument. Then she told them what she knew about Sterling Voss and what he'd done to other ranching families in the western counties, and she watched every face in the room while she said it. Most of the men she could read easily. Connell looked sick with anger. 2 others looked shaken. An older hand named Baskin had the expression of a man who was recalculating things he'd assumed were accidents. Hatch was harder to read. His arms stayed crossed. His face stayed neutral. But his eyes did something. A small, involuntary movement, a flick toward the door and back. The kind of thing you'd only catch if you were looking for it. She was looking for it. She didn't call him out. She finished speaking and asked if anyone had noticed anything they hadn't reported, and 3 men mentioned small things. A stranger on horseback near the north fence 2 weeks prior, a gate that had been found open that no one could account for. She wrote all of it down. When the men filed out, Hatch was the last to go. At the door he stopped and looked at her. "That's quite a story," he said. His voice was careful, more careful than his usual register. "It's not a story," she said. "It's a record." He held her gaze for a second and then he left. Rudd waited until the door closed. "You think it's him," he said. "I think he knows more than he said," she told him. "Whether he understood what he was doing, whether he knew what he was passing to whom, that I don't know yet. But I'm going to find out." She went to her room that night and added everything to the file set. the cistern contamination, the vial, the East Trough, Earl Kelsey's written account, the notes from the hands in the meeting. She organized it in the order a federal investigator would need to read it: chronological, sourced, each incident linked to the next by the thread of method and timing that connected them all back to a single origin point. It was past midnight when she finished. She capped the pen and closed the notebook and sat at the window for a while in the dark. The windmill was turning. The sky was clear enough to read by, almost. She thought about Earl Kelsey's brother Tom, who'd died worn out 2 years after losing his land to a man who'd never once dirtied his own hands doing it. She thought about the Aldersons, wherever they were in New Mexico. She thought about 9 other families whose names she'd written from the county records, and who probably didn't know that someone was, right now, in the middle of the night, building the case that might finally prove what had been done to them. Then she stopped thinking about all of it and just sat in the quiet for a while, because some nights that was the only thing left to do. Sit with the weight of it without trying to carry it anywhere. Just let it be what it was. The file on her table was 41 pages. She had Pryor's signed report, Earl Kelsey's signed account, public land records covering 6 years of Voss's acquisitions, detailed notes on 7 separate incidents at Blackstone Ranch, and a timeline that began before she arrived and continued to tonight. It wasn't finished, but it was close enough that she could see what finished looked like, and it looked like enough. She mailed the file on a Friday. Not all of it. She kept the originals because she wasn't careless, but a complete copy, organized and indexed, sent by registered post to the Federal Land Office in Austin with a cover letter she'd drafted and redrafted 4 times before she was satisfied with the language. The letter named Sterling Voss by his full name, and named the 3 holding companies she'd identified in the county records. It listed 11 properties and the prices paid. It attached Pryor's signed chemical analysis, Earl Kelsey's signed statement, and a timeline of incidents at Blackstone Ranch spanning the 3 weeks since her arrival, each entry dated and sourced. She did not write it as a plea. She wrote it as a presentation of evidence, the way her father had taught her to present a survey. Here is what I found. Here is how I found it. Here is what it means. She signed her full name at the bottom: Evelyn Carter Mercer, Blackstone Ranch, Harlow County, Texas. Then she rode to Harlow and handed it to the postmaster herself and watched him stamp it and put it in the outgoing bag. On the ride home, she felt neither relieved nor triumphant. She felt the particular flatness that comes after sustained effort when the effort is no longer in your hands. The strange emptiness of having done the thing you set out to do and now having to wait for the world to respond to it. She'd built the best case she could build with what she had. Whether it was enough depended on people in Austin she'd never met, working on a timeline she couldn't control. She didn't tell Gavin the letter was sent until that evening. He was at the table with the ranch ledgers when she came in, which he'd been doing more of lately. The careful, systematic work of understanding exactly where the ranch's finances stood after months of damage. She'd suggested it. She'd also suggested some adjustments to which pastures were being used for grazing while the creek water remained under restriction, and a temporary change to the water rotation that kept the cattle off the compromised sources entirely until the contamination had time to clear. He'd implemented all of it without making her feel like she was overstepping, which was the thing she'd least expected from him. She sat down across from him and said, "The file went out today. To Austin." He set his pen down. He looked at her with the expression he'd developed over the past 3 weeks. Not the careful, measuring look of the first days, but something more direct, more settled, like a man who'd stopped bracing and started trusting. "How long?" he asked. "I don't know. Federal processes don't move fast." She put her hands flat on the table. "It could be weeks. It could be longer. In the meantime, Voss doesn't know the file exists. As far as he knows, this ranch is still struggling and we're still reactive." She paused. "I want to keep it that way." Gavin nodded slowly. "And Hatch?" That was the question she'd been turning over for 3 days. After the meeting, Hatch had worked his usual hours and said his usual things and given her nothing definitive. No confession, no confrontation, nothing she could point to and call proof. But the small things accumulated. He asked questions he had no work-related reason to ask. He was oddly interested in the waterline repairs. Once she caught him lingering near the porch, when she and Gavin were talking at a volume he shouldn't have been able to hear from where he was standing. I want to use him, she said. Gavin's eyebrows moved. Use him? If he's passing information to someone connected to Voss, then what he passes is what Voss knows. So I want to give him something specific to pass. She looked at Gavin directly. I want you to tell him, casually, in passing, that you've decided to take Voss up on his offer, that you've been thinking about it, and you're going to reach out to him next week about the terms. The room was quiet. That'll bring Voss here, Gavin said. Yes, she said. It will. And I want him here. I want him to come to this table thinking he's won, and I want to watch what he does and says when he thinks the ranch is already his, because men like Voss get careless when they think they've won. She leaned forward, and I want a witness in the room when he does it, Rudd, someone Voss won't think to perform for. Gavin picked up his pen and set it down again. He did that when he was working something through. You're not worried he'll push to close it fast? Sign something before we can stop it? I won't let anything be signed, she said. I'll be in the room. He's not going to like that. A woman in a business meeting. No, she agreed. He's not. Which means he'll say things he wouldn't say if he thought I was paying full attention. She looked at her hands. Men who dismiss you give you a lot of information. Voss has been dismissing every ranching family he's ever targeted. He's never once encountered anyone who was documenting while he was talking. Gavin looked at her for a long moment with an expression she didn't have a clean word for. It wasn't admiration exactly. It was something more complicated, the look of a man confronting a reality that kept being larger than he'd measured it. All right, he said. I'll tell Hatch tomorrow morning. She went to bed that night and slept better than she had in weeks. Hatch got the information on a Saturday. By Wednesday, a rider arrived at Blackstone Ranch with a note on Voss Industries letterhead. Clean, expensive paper, the kind that was meant to communicate something about the man behind it before you'd read a word. The note expressed that Mr. Voss would be pleased to visit Blackstone Ranch at Gavin's convenience and suggested the following Friday. Gavin sent back a single line. Friday suits us fine. Evelyn spent the days between Wednesday and Friday doing two things simultaneously. She continued the daily log. The water system was stabilizing. The 3 sick calves were recovering since they'd been moved to clean water, and the perimeter fence had been fully repaired and was now being checked on a rotating schedule. And she prepared for the meeting with the specific kind of preparation that didn't show. She didn't rehearse speeches. She thought about what Voss would want to accomplish in this meeting, what he'd expect to find, and what he'd say when he found it. She thought about where his blind spots were, based on everything she'd learned about how he operated. She thought about what question, asked at the right moment, would cause a careful man to become less careful. She also wrote a second letter, not to Austin, but to the county clerk in Harlow, requesting certified copies of the land transaction records she'd reviewed in person. She wanted official copies, stamped and verified, that couldn't be questioned as transcriptions. The clerk sent them back within 2 days with a note that was professionally neutral and a stamp that was very satisfying to look at. Those went into the original file. Sterling Voss arrived on Friday at 10 in the morning in a buggy that was better maintained than anything else on the road between Lubbock and Harlow. He was younger than Evelyn had constructed in her imagination. Mid-40s, well-dressed without being showy, with a face that had probably been charming at 30 and had since grown into something more deliberate. He carried himself with the ease of a man who'd been in control of most rooms he'd entered for a very long time. He shook Gavin's hand in the yard, and his eyes went to Evelyn once, briefly, with the assessment that took about 2 seconds and arrived at its conclusion without any additional information. She was background. She was the wife. She was furniture in the room where the real conversation would happen. She watched him decide that and let him keep it. They went inside. Rudd was already at the table, ostensibly reviewing the fence repair schedule, which was the cover story they'd agreed on. Voss sat across from Gavin and put his leather folder on the table and opened it to the offer document. The same one, Gavin had told her, that he'd brought to the kitchen 3 weeks before she arrived. The number had gone up slightly, which told her something. Voss thought the ranch was closer to breaking than it actually was, and he was trying to close before anyone regrouped. I appreciate you reconsidering, Voss said. His voice was smooth and confident. the voice of a man who'd had this conversation many times and knew exactly how it went. I want you to know this offer reflects genuine interest in the Blackstone property. This is fair value for land in its current condition. Current condition. Evelyn noted the phrase. What do you plan to do with it? Gavin asked. He sounded tired in a convincing way, the exhaustion of a man who'd been fighting something too long and was near to giving up. He was better at this than Evelyn had expected. Voss smiled the way he'd smiled in her imagination, which told her the imagination had been accurate. Development. Western County land has real potential for the right kind of operation, larger-scale cattle running, possibly some mineral exploration depending on the survey results. The water's been problematic, Gavin said. You know about the issues we've been having. I'd heard, Voss said, and the ease with which he said it, the complete, unstudied ease of a man who'd heard because he'd arranged it, was the most clarifying thing Evelyn had witnessed since arriving at Blackstone Ranch. He hadn't even paused. He'd just said it. She kept her face exactly where it was. Water issues on Western County land aren't unusual, Voss continued. With the right infrastructure investment, it's manageable. The cattle losses have been significant, Gavin said. Also manageable once the land is under proper management. He slid the offer document across the table. This price accounts for the current state of the operation. I think you'll find it's the most realistic number you're going to see, given the circumstances. Given the circumstances he had manufactured. Evelyn let it sit in her chest without moving her face. My wife has been going over the ranch's financials, Gavin said, and turned to her. Voss looked at her. He did it the way men do when they're being polite about an interruption, turning the full apparatus of their attention towards something they've already decided isn't relevant, performing attentiveness while actually just waiting for it to be over. Mrs. Mercer, he said. Mr. Voss. She folded her hands on the table. I've been reviewing the land transaction records for the western counties over the past 6 years as part of my assessment of what this property is genuinely worth. Something shifted in his face. Not much. A small recalibration, the kind a careful man makes when a conversation moves in a direction he hadn't expected. That's thorough of you, he said. I found some interesting patterns, she said. Properties that sold significantly below regional value. 11 of them, through 3 separate holding companies. Landover Partners, Southwestern Range LLC, and Mesa Capital Holdings. She watched his face carefully. Those are all yours, aren't they? The room was very quiet. Voss looked at her for a moment with an expression that was working hard to stay pleasant. I have various business interests, he said. I'm not sure what you think you've found. I found the Alderson property, she said, and the Kelsey property, and 9 others. I found that in 4 of those cases there were documented incidents prior to the sale, water problems, livestock illness, structural fires, that look remarkably similar to what's been happening here. She kept her voice even. I also had the water in your creek analyzed, professionally, by an assay chemist in Harlow. His report identifies an industrial compound that has no natural origin in a cattle ranch's water source. Voss set his hands flat on the table. The ease was gone. What replaced it was something more controlled, more calculating, and she recognized it for what it was. A man deciding which version of denial to use. That's a serious accusation, he said. His voice was still smooth, but it had changed register, cooler now. The charm had a ceiling, and they'd found it. I haven't accused you of anything, Evelyn said. I've described what's in a file that was mailed to the Federal Land Office in Austin 10 days ago. Signed chemical analyses, certified land transaction records, a sworn statement from Earl Kelsey regarding what happened to his brother's property, and a detailed timeline of incidents at this ranch going back to the week before I arrived. She paused. I imagine someone from that office will be in contact with you in the coming weeks. Voss stood up. He did it slowly, the way men do when they want the act of standing to mean something, to reclaim the physical advantage of height, to reassert some kind of control over the geometry of the room. He looked at Gavin. I came here in good faith, he said. You came here because my hand told you we were selling, Gavin said, because that same hand has been telling you things about this ranch for weeks. I'd think carefully about what that looks like to a federal investigator. Voss picked up his folder. His face had arranged itself into something that was not quite a threat, but was close enough to one to be unmistakable. "You don't know what you're involving yourself in," he said. He said it to Gavin, but he glanced at Evelyn when he said it. "I know exactly what I'm involving myself in," Evelyn said. "I've been documenting it for 3 weeks." He left. The sound of his buggy leaving the yard was distinct and final in a way that felt different from the sound of a normal departure. Rudd, who had not said a single word for the entire meeting, looked at Evelyn from across the table. "Well," he said. Gavin let out a long breath and sat back. He looked at the empty space where Voss's offer document had been. He'd taken it with him, which Evelyn had expected and which didn't matter because she had the certified copies of all the records that mattered. "He's going to push back," Gavin said. "Yes," she said. "He will, but now he knows there's a file in Austin, and he knows it's complete enough that I could summarize it in that room from memory. Whatever he does next, he'll be doing it with that knowledge." She stood up and smoothed her skirt and looked at both of them. "We wait, and we keep documenting, every day until the investigators arrive." Dale Hatch was gone by that evening. He didn't say he was leaving. He packed his things and took his horse and was absent at supper, and when Gavin found his bunk empty, he came to Evelyn and told her, and she nodded and said she'd expected it. A man who'd been feeding information to the other side didn't wait around once the other side collapsed. She felt, looking at the empty bunk, not anger, but something more like sadness for the particular kind of person who makes those choices without understanding the full cost of them until it's too late. She wrote it in the log, date, time, circumstance, because even the small human failures were part of the record. The federal investigators arrived 5 weeks later. There were 2 of them, both out of the Austin Land Office, and they were thorough in the way that people are thorough when they've arrived with prior knowledge of what they're looking for. They spent 3 days at the ranch reviewing everything Evelyn had assembled, asking her questions for hours at a stretch, requesting additional detail on specific incidents. She gave them everything. She answered precisely and completely and didn't editorialize, because her father had taught her that evidence speaks for itself if you've gathered it correctly, and the worst thing you can do is talk so much that you get between the evidence and the person reading it. On the 3rd evening, the senior investigator, a compact, serious woman named Aldridge, who had the particular economy of movement that comes from spending years doing painstaking work, sat across from Evelyn at the kitchen table and said, "This is the most organized private evidence file I've received from a civilian complainant in 14 years. My father was a land surveyor," Evelyn said. Aldridge looked at her in the evaluating way she'd been looking at Evelyn for 3 days. "That's not what made this," she said. "The surveying background gave you the vocabulary. What made this is that you started from the first day. Before you knew exactly what you were looking at, you were already recording it." She paused. "Most people wait until they're certain. By then the evidence is gone." Evelyn thought about that for a moment. "My father used to say that certainty is what you get after you've documented, not before." "Smart man," Aldridge said. The investigation into Sterling Voss and his network of holding companies took 8 months from the time the investigators left Blackstone Ranch. It was not a clean 8 months. Voss had resources and he used them. He hired lawyers who filed procedural objections. He challenged the admissibility of Pryor's report through a competing chemist whose credentials turned out to be questionable. He attempted to reframe the land transactions as voluntary sales at fair market value. None of it held. The file Evelyn had built was too complete, the pattern across 11 properties too consistent, Earl Kelsey's account too specific in its detail, and the chemical analysis too technically sound to be dismissed by a hired expert whose own credentials couldn't survive scrutiny. Midway through the investigation, the Aldersons were located in New Mexico, and their account was added to the record. They'd kept a journal, a handwritten record of what had happened to their property in the months before they sold, that corroborated the method in specific enough detail that even Voss's attorneys went quiet about alternative explanations. Someone else had been documenting too. They just hadn't known, at the time, that it would matter. Sterling Voss was indicted on federal charges of land fraud, conspiracy, and criminal contamination of water sources. The criminal case was separate from the civil proceedings, which were longer and more complicated and involved attorneys Evelyn read about in newspaper accounts over the following years. But the criminal indictment came down 14 months after she'd sat at a kitchen table in Harlow County and written a cover letter to the Austin Land Office. And when Gavin brought the newspaper in from the road and set it on the table in front of her, she read the headline twice and then set the paper down and went back to the ledger she'd been working on. Gavin looked at her. "That's it," he said. "That's the beginning of it," she said. "The courts are the end of it. That takes longer. Can you just—" He stopped. He made a gesture with his hand that meant something like, "Allow yourself this for 1 minute." She looked at the headline again. She thought about Tom Kelsey, who'd worn out and died. She thought about the Aldersons in New Mexico, starting over in their 60s. She thought about 9 other families whose names she knew from county records, and who she'd never met, and who had lost things that couldn't be fully recovered even if every legal proceeding went exactly right. "It's something," she said finally. "It's not everything, but it's something." Gavin sat down across from her. He'd changed in the 8 months since Voss's visit. Not dramatically, the way change works in stories, but in the gradual way that people change when they've been through something real. He was less guarded. He laughed occasionally now, which he hadn't done at all in the first weeks. He'd stopped treating the ranch's problems as private failures and started treating them as problems to be solved, which was a distinction that sounded small and wasn't. "I owe you something," he said. She looked up from the ledger. "You don't." "Not a debt," he said. "That's not what I mean." He chose his words the way he always did, carefully, like a man who'd learned to be precise because imprecision had cost him before. "What you did here. Not just the file, not just Voss. The way you came into this place and took it seriously, the whole of it. The animals, and the water, and the fence line, and the land. You took it seriously when I'd half stopped." She held his gaze. "I'd been so focused on surviving what was happening that I'd lost track of why I was trying to survive it," he said. "You never did that. You came in and you looked at this place and you decided it was worth the full effort." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to know how you did that. When nobody here made it easy for you." She thought about how to answer that honestly. The honest answer wasn't elegant. "I've spent my whole life in places that didn't make it easy," she said. "You learn to decide whether a thing is worth your effort before you arrive, not after. Because after, it's already hard, and if you're deciding, then you'll always find a reason to stop." She looked at her hands on the ledger. "I decided this place was worth it before I got off that wagon. Not because I knew you or knew the ranch. Because it needed the work and I knew how to do the work. That was enough." Gavin was quiet for a long time. The kitchen was full of afternoon light, the particular gold light of a Texas afternoon that makes everything look like something worth keeping. "Stay," he said. She looked at him. "I mean, I know you're here. I mean, stay in the way that means you want to be here. Not because it was arranged, because you want to." He said it with the specific awkwardness of a man who'd thought about saying something for a long time and was saying it before he talked himself out of it again. "I know that's not a simple thing to ask. I know the arrangement isn't what either of us chose, but I'm asking something different than the arrangement." Evelyn sat with that for a moment. The window above the kitchen sink showed the yard, and beyond the yard the pasture, and beyond the pasture the flat Texas distance that went on until it became sky. She'd learned that distance over 8 months, where the fence lines ran, where the water moved underground, where the grass grew strong, and where it needed help. She knew this land now in the way you know something you've worked with your hands. She knew the man across from her in a similar way. Not completely, not without remaining unknowns, but in the way that matters. She knew how he thought, what he valued, where he was honest, and where he still struggled to be. She knew he was better than he'd been when she arrived, and she suspected she was better too, in ways she was still figuring out. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a romantic speech. It was just true, said plainly, the way she said true things. Gavin looked at her in that way he had, the look that kept updating itself, that kept finding her larger than the last measurement. He nodded once. She went back to the ledger. The north pasture pump was fully rebuilt that spring, not patched, but rebuilt from the ground up, with new housing and new couplings and a secondary line that ran as backup. The cistern was cleaned and relined and fitted with a cover that locked. The creek ran clean by summer. Pryor tested it twice more and signed off on both reports. and Evelyn filed both in the ongoing record because she filed everything, always. The cattle that had sickened recovered fully. The herd grew that year, and the year after. The grass in the north pasture came back thick once the water was consistent, the way grass does when you give it what it needs and stop doing damage to the system that feeds it. Rudd retired 3 years in, on his own terms, which was the way he'd wanted to go. His going-away supper was at the main house table, and Evelyn made the meal herself, which she'd gotten much better at without ever becoming the kind of cook people rhapsodized about. It was good food, honest food, the kind that did the work it was supposed to do. At the supper, Rudd looked at her across the table and said, with the bluntness that was his primary mode of communication, "I didn't think you'd last a week." "I know," she said. "I was wrong." "I know that too." He almost smiled. It was as close as Rudd got, and from him it meant more than a full smile from most people. The Voss criminal case concluded 4 years after the indictment. He was convicted on the majority of charges, with sentencing that reflected the scope of what he'd done. Not just what he'd done to Blackstone Ranch, but the full record across 11 properties, the whole accumulated damage of a man who'd spent 6 years systematically destroying what other people had built in order to acquire it cheaply. The civil proceedings ran longer. Some of the families recovered portions of what they'd lost. Some didn't. The law can build accountability, but it can't always restore what's gone, and Evelyn understood that distinction without bitterness, because bitterness was a thing she'd decided a long time ago she couldn't afford. What she thought about, in the years after, wasn't the legal outcome. It was the Alderson Journal, the handwritten record that a woman named Margaret Alderson had kept in a cloth-covered notebook, sitting at her kitchen table in the months before she and her husband lost their property, writing down what was happening because she didn't know what else to do with it, and she couldn't bear for it to go unrecorded. She hadn't known anyone would ever read it. She'd written it because some part of her understood that the truth deserved to exist on paper, even if no one ever came looking for it. That was the thing Evelyn came back to, the impulse to document, to record, to insist that what is real should be written down. It lives in people before they know it will matter. Margaret Alderson didn't know her notebook would become part of a federal case. She just knew that what was being done to her family was true, and she wrote it down. There's a particular kind of strength in that, not the dramatic kind that people recognize easily, not the kind that goes into a burning barn while everyone else stands still. The quieter kind. The kind that sits at a table in a difficult season and writes down what it sees, clearly and without flinching, because the truth is worth the effort of recording even when you can't yet see what it will be used for. Evelyn had learned both kinds from 2 different people, the first from her father, who'd spent 20 years looking at land carefully and writing down what he found. The second from herself, at 29, in a strange room in a ranch that wasn't yet hers, in the middle of a night that smelled of smoke. She never stopped keeping the log. Long after the cistern was clean and the creek was clear and the fences held and the cattle were strong and Voss's name was a closed case in a federal file in Austin, she kept the daily record of Blackstone Ranch, what happened when, in what condition, signed by her hand. Not because she expected another fight, though ranching life always had something in it that warranted attention, but because she believed in the record itself, in the act of looking at a thing squarely and writing down what you saw. She believed it was one of the most fundamental things a person could do, refuse to let what is real become invisible. The ranch grew, the years stacked. The land she'd learned in her first desperate weeks became land she knew in her bones, the way you know things that have asked something real of you and received it. She was not the woman who'd been mocked at the gate on her first morning, and she was not entirely different from her either. The same stillness, the same observing quiet, the same incapacity to walk past something that needed looking at. Those things hadn't changed. What had changed was everything around them. The place that held those qualities now, and the person who shared it with her, and the life that had been built from what looked, once, like nothing more than an arrangement nobody wanted. It turned out to be the thing she'd been building toward her entire life, though she couldn't have told you that at the start. You rarely can. You just do the work in front of you, and you document what you find, and you stay when it's worth staying. And some years later, you look up from the ledger, and the window is full of afternoon light, and the pasture is green and the water runs clean, and you understand without needing to say it that this is what belonging feels like when you've earned it rather than been given it. Not a gift, not luck, not the mercy of people finally deciding to accept you, just the place you built with your own hands, from the truth you refuse to stop telling.